For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome. Last week of August in India's recent history is significant because of two major events in the relationship between India and China. That's the subject that I'm going to talk about in this week's Simply Nitin. I'm Nitin Gokhale. So what happened in the last week of August? You take your mind back to 2017, when on 28th of August 2017, India and China announced through a bland, formal press statement issued simultaneously in New Delhi and in Beijing the disengagement and withdrawal of forces at what is more popularly known as Doklam, but actually is the site called Dolam, on the tri-junction of India, China and Bhutan, the boundary between these three countries. That happened 4 years ago. In 2020, exactly 1 year ago, on 29th of August, India launched a counter-offensive, a counter-move on the Kailash range of mountains in Ladakh, catching the Chinese by surprise and thereby achieving a major turning point in this nearly year-long standoff between Indian and Chinese forces in Ladakh. What happened in 2020, I will talk about a little later. But first, 2017 and the flashback to that event. In 2017, around the first week of June, the Chinese forces wanted to extend a kacha track or a dirt track into a territory of Bhutan on the tri-junction of India, China and Bhutan in the Chumbi Valley. That dirt track has been developed by China inch by inch since 2005. But in 2017, Indian forces walked across its border with Bhutan and stopped the advance of the Chinese forces, especially the Chinese construction engineers and their equipment, and stood firm, not allowing the Chinese to go forward. This was unprecedented. It was the first time that India had gone across into a third country and stopped the Chinese advance. So what happened? For the first time in the history of India-China border dispute, India actually took up the fight on behalf of Bhutan, which is a tiny, small country sandwiched between India and China, and which was suffering the creeping tactics of the Chinese for a number of years. But this time, Indian forces stopped the Chinese in the Bhutan territory. So what happened? The Chinese always expected Bhutan to protest diplomatically because it is a smaller country. And then they got away with it because they continued to advance forward despite Bhutanese diplomatic protest. What they didn't expect in 2017 was the fact that India would intervene militarily. Because of that intervention, a mini crisis occurred between India, China and Bhutan, but between mainly India and China. Now it continued for over 2.5 months, nearly 75 days, because India stood firm and said that unless China withdraws its construction equipment and stops the construction of the track leading into a very crucial area called Jhamperi Ridge, India will not go back from there. The Chinese were in a dilemma. They didn't want to escalate the matter, but they also wanted India to withdraw because an important summit was coming up in China in the first week of September 2017. That and India's firm stand forced the Chinese to go back from where they had come on that dirt track. That was one of the first miscalculations the Chinese did with India in the past 5 years or so. In 2014, there was another incident in a place called Chumur, which is in the southeast of the Ladakh LAC, the line of actual control, where again India had forced the Chinese to go back after a 10-day or a 20-day standoff there. And this was the time when President Xi Jinping was actually on a visit to India. So India told him very firmly that this is not acceptable. We are supposed to be cooperating. We are supposed to be friends. We are supposed to be doing a lot of multilateral and bilateral cooperation. And then you come and occupy, or you come and ingress into Indian territory. So that was the precedence in 2014. Then, of course, 2017, Doklam happened. But the biggest and the longest standoff in recent times was in Ladakh. As all of you know, we have done extensive coverage there. So when the Chinese started trying to make inroads into various sectors along the LAC in Ladakh, in Pangang Tso first, then in Gogra and Hot Springs, in Galwan, and then carrying on with its dispute or its attempts to come into the disputed area of Depsang and Demchok, then India was initially caught by surprise. So the quantum of troops brought in Ladakh, as you are aware, was much higher than ever before in the past 30 years or so. India, of course, reacted swiftly, mobilized as many troops as the Chinese had brought in, and there was a mirror deployment, as we have been saying all along since May 2020. But what happened in the last week of August 2020 was something that the Chinese didn't expect. Now, they had occupied the areas between Finger 4 and Finger 8 in Pangang Tso, but there was hardly any bargaining chip with India, because everywhere else the Chinese troops and the Indian troops were face to face, but they had no other way of forcing or persuading the Chinese to go back. So the Indian security establishment, India's army headquarters, the Northern Command, and of course the political clearance at the highest level, decided that some counter move which will force the Chinese to negotiate had to be done. So in the last few days of August, 29th, 30th and 31st of August 2020, India moved swiftly to occupy never ever occupied ranges of the Kailash Range mountain, which oversees or overlooks into the Chinese camp at Moldo, on the Chushul-Moldo sector, where the border personnel meetings take place, where all the negotiations between the corps commanders have been happening on either side of the meeting point. Now, all these peaks, the peaks along the Kailash Range, were occupied by India in a very swift operation, very quick operation, followed by tanks, T-72s and T-90s going up right there on the Kailash Range. Now this was completely unexpected as far as the Chinese were concerned. So as India took the tanks up the Kailash Range, the Chinese were also forced to bring in tanks, but they were always on the back foot because India had taken the advantage, the first mover's advantage. Over the next 4 months until February, the Chinese kept asking for disengagement from that point, because the tanks at some places on either side were ranged against each other hardly 150 meters away from each other. It was a tense period for both India and China. Any miscalculation would have meant triggering off a conflict which nobody wanted. So the Chinese kept asking for the withdrawal of the forces which were eyeball to eyeball in that sector on the Kailash Range. Next few rounds, starting from the 8th round of negotiations, actually from the 7th round onwards, the Chinese started saying, let's disengage from here and then let's talk about others. So India wanted the disengagement to happen first at Pangang Tso, which the Kailash Range deployment actually facilitated and forced the Chinese to do. So this week was extremely important, where this maneuver was done, where this counter move was done by India, and finally led to the first phase of disengagement, where all these visuals you will see in February this year, when the two sides started withdrawing their tanks, their APCs, the armored personnel carriers, and the eyeball to eyeball confrontation first in the Kailash Range mountains, the Pangang Tso Lake, on the north bank of the Pangang Tso and on the south bank of the Pangang Tso, which was the first phase of disengagement. Then, of course, subsequently, we have seen disengagements at Gogra. At Galwan, of course, they had disengaged even immediately after the clash on 15 June 2020. So gradually, because of that action of India in the last week of August 2020, the disengagement began. Now only PP-15 or Petrol Point 15 confrontation or standoff is remaining at the moment. And of course, the Demchok and the Depsang Plains standoff, which predates the current crisis in Ladakh, will be taken up as and when the higher level authorities meet. So August has been quite eventful for India over the past 4 years, first in Dolam and then in Ladakh. I wanted to refresh your memories with those events and also remind you that for the Chinese, this was a new experience. Indian forces standing firm and not willing to withdraw, like what they had done in 1967 at Nathula, or what they had done in Sumdurungchu. But there was a long gap after Sumdurungchu in 1987, where Indian forces had not stood firm for such a long time, or India had not taken proactive steps against the Chinese mischief and ingress into the line of actual control that India feels is its territory. Therefore, it's important to understand the significance of these events that occurred in the last week of August. Coincidentally, we are speaking on 28th of August this year. The actions that happened, as I mentioned, either the disengagement that happened in Doklam on 28th of August 2017, and of course the action in Kailash range of the mountains in Ladakh had happened on 29th of August. So that's all I have this week. But remember, the Chinese are not going anywhere, neither is India. And for the first time, India has started looking at the Chinese very seriously. The rebalance of forces has occurred because of what happened in Ladakh in 2020. And that long-term challenge with the Chinese forces, the Chinese PLA, will remain. But India is now taking steps to meet that challenge. That's a separate subject. I'll come back to you with more on other editions of Simply Nitin. But for the moment, I wanted to just flag these two dates and the significance of these two events. You know where to, of course, follow us on YouTube and social media handles. Please spread the word amongst friends, families, your acquaintances, your like-minded people, because we need more and more support, more and more subscribers for our YouTube channel. And of course, keep supporting us in whichever way you can, either financially or by following us on various social media handles, which you know what they are. They keep flashing on the screen. Until the next time, it's goodbye.